freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported talk radio station, throwing ourselves upon the gears of the machine. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
You called down the thunder, well now you got it.
Right! You tell them I'm coming! And hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Revolution Radio. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Good evening, folks. This is Diamond with the Oppenheimer Ranch Project, bringing you another edition of the Inconvenient Truth, prepping for the Grand Solar Minimum. Tonight we have an amazing guest. I can't wait to get to talk to him. Dr. Tim Ball, author of Human-Caused Global Warming, The Biggest Deception in History, which you can get for just $5.99 on Kindle, and I'm sure Tim will talk to us about it. Now, before we get started, a lot has happened over the last week. As far as climatically, we have extreme weather events that we've been covering on the channel, which are in line with the predictions that we're making with the coming Grand Solar Minimum, the shutdown of the sun, and the changing magnetosphere on the Earth. Now, Tim Ball is known in many circles as a climate denier, and if you Google Dr. Tim Ball, you're going to get up in the top few hits some of the nonsense from D-Smog blog, where he says that, where they say that Dr. Ball is a professor of geography that hangs out. He's a prolific speaker and writer in the skeptical science community. Well, thank God, because we're part of that community, and we want to welcome Tim Ball. Tim, are you here? Can you hear us, Tim? Maybe you're on mute. Well, I don't hear Dr. Ball. He's not on the line, so we'll wait for Scott to see what he can get him back on the line, and we'll go over some of Tim's credentials. Now, he has a BA from University of Winnipeg in 1970, an MA from the University of Manitoba, 1971, and he got his PhD at the University of London in England in 1982, which I believe he is now was a doctor of geography, where he studied, I guess, climatic shifts, because he's well aware that climate change is cyclic. And being a paleoclimatologist, I know that those cycles are on many scales. Let me go over here to Skype and see if I can find out what's going on. Scott, are you there? And where's Tim? Can you text me some information? Because we had really redundantly made sure that Tim was available for the show tonight for your pleasure. So we're going to make sure we can get him up. And maybe I'm waiting on some information from Scott. So let's just go over the DeSmog blog, NSRP Denier Connections. Now, what they claim is that past lists of scientific advisors have included the prominent deniers, Tim Patterson, Tad Murty, Sally Balunas, all of which are also listed advisors of the FOS. Now, this is the interesting thing, how we get labeled deniers. Now, I have been a stratigrapher since the early 1990s. I got my undergraduate degree in 1993 from Temple University. And what I learned is that climate is cyclic. I mean, we had the Greenland ice core data exposed to us early on in the 90s. As they were getting samples, we were very aware that there was huge climate cycles. And at the time, I was working on the Milankovitch theory of orbital forcing. And so we were unraveling some of the larger 100,000-year, 26,000-year precession of the equinox cycles in those cores. But the small-scale cyclicity that came out of the cores, which we now use on our radio show, make it very clear that there is an 800 to 1,000-year grand solar minimum cycle, which we call the empire cycle, or you can call it solar maximum. However you look at it, in our historic past, there have been empires that rise and fall on a periodicity of 1,000 years. And we can go all the way back to the Minoans. We can go further back than that period of time. But this is a regular periodic interval of, I'm still not getting any info from Scott. Scott, can you hear me? Okay, Scott.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. What's going on?
Okay. Yeah, his phone number is not linking in, so I'm gonna try a couple more times and see what we can't do. But every time I call his number, it doesn't hook into Skype here. So let me keep trying, and you keep rolling.
He has a Skype address.
Yeah, I'm gonna get him to accept me. I put a request into him, so I'm gonna call him up and have him accept that. See if I can get him in that way. Okay.
Okay.
I'll be right back with you guys.
We'll be hanging tough. Thanks.
Cool.
So the first PhD in climatology. Apparently, some people in the hater crowd that do not like Dr. Tim Ball, including the IPCC. Now, this goes very deep. This poor guy that we're about to talk to, as soon as our producer gets him on the line, he has been sued to the tune of, in his personal money, he has spent over $500,000, upwards of $600,000 to defend himself and the real science that he does, because the IPCC did not like what he had to say. He attacked them at the core of their science and their scam, and this guy is a hero in my eyes. Dr. Tim Ball is a hero to all climate deniers like us who believe we do not deny climate. We know that climate is ever-changing, but what we're very skeptical of as scientists is the anthropogenic nature of climate change. And back in the 90s, the early 90s, when we were really dropped the bomb of global warming, where that was where all the funding was going to be, we actually sat down with the statistical analysis team at the university to discuss if it was even possible to determine if man was affecting the climate. And the statistical analysis team said we didn't have enough data to even begin to even know if we could even tell if there was an anthropogenic effect. Now, what I can tell you as a scientist is that the anthropogenic effect of man on our planet is very real. And it goes back to the 1970s when we finally passed the Clean Water Act, when we had rivers near major cities like Pittsburgh lighting on fire because of the toxins being dumped by major corporations into these waterways. So pollution is a major concern. Now, these globalists, which are the global warming alarmists, they are trying to convince, and they have pretty well convinced the population that CO2 is a pollutant, which is absolute nonsense. Geologically speaking, we are at the lowest CO2 concentration in Earth's history. It's only been this low one other time in the last 500 million years. So we are currently at some of the lowest CO2 concentrations ever, which means that for most of the geologic history, since plants have been terrestrial, which is about 420 million years, there has been CO2 in our atmosphere at higher levels than it is today. And these globalists get away, and the media gets away with claiming that CO2 is running away and we're all going to burn up and die, which is an absolute false notion. The amount of sea level rise has been constant since we came out of the last mini ice age, solar minimum, back in the Dalton Minimum in the early 1800s. Global sea level began to rise, not because of melting ice, another misnomer. Sea levels rise because of something called thermal expansion. The only way you can get the ocean to rise is to heat it up. And the oceans have been heating since that last solar minimum. So the whole notion that catastrophic sea level rise is going to inundate major cities is a complete farce. But what you should be worried about, and the rest of the 70% of the population living on the coast of the world, is a major tsunami, because we are headed into a solar minimum unlike any solar minimum in modern history. This is a major grand solar minimum, which happens to be lining up with a magnetic reversal, which is only going to add insult to injury to the global effects. And if you look back at the central Greenland temperatures, the Minoan warm is estimated to be up to 3 degrees centigrade warmer than today. That's 3,500 years before present. And after this Minoan warm period, we had the Mycenaean civilization collapse. Places were plundered. The Hittite Empire fell. It was the end of the Bronze Age. There were droughts in the U.S., in India, in Europe, in Africa, in China, and in West Asia.
Okay, are we on now?
Tim.
Hello.
Well, Tim, we've been talking about climate change. We gave a wonderful introduction on your academic career, and we started to talk a little bit about some of the nonsense being spewed by DSmog blog. And what I did was I clued in the audience to the fact that you've personally spent over $500,000 defending yourself to the IPCC and these other globalists that are absolutely perpetrating the largest fraud in history.
Oh, no question about it. And in fact, all three of the lawsuits brought against me were by the same lawyer in West Vancouver, and all on behalf of members of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I won one of the cases so far, but I'm getting ready for the second lawsuit. And one of the things, of course, that Americans have got to learn from all of this is that what makes you exceptional is your free speech. The rest of the world doesn't have that, and I'm living proof of it here in Canada. These lawsuits wouldn't even have been filed in the United States.
No, it's absolute lunacy. Let's talk about your book real quick.
Yep.
Human Caused Global Warming. When did it get published?
Okay. Okay, let me back up for a little bit to give just a bit of background on myself, Scott, because I served... I'm
Diamond. Scott's the producer. I'm Diamond.
Oh, okay, Diamond. Sorry. Okay, this is another difference between America and the rest of the world. I served 9 years in the Canadian military. The Canadians treat their military like dirt, and especially the veterans. It's really disgraceful. But anyway, I did 4 years of anti-submarine in the over the North Atlantic during the Cuban crisis, and then I served 5 years of search and rescue in Arctic Canada. And one of the things that I learned from that experience was how bad weather forecasting was. And so when I lost my flying category because of hearing loss, and it took me 40 years to get a pension for that from the government, I went back to university and started looking at why is weather forecasting so bad, and of course discovered that climate forecasting was just as bad, if not worse. And so that's how I got into this. When I started, of course, global cooling was the consensus back in the late 60s and early 70s. And then I watched the whole discipline get hijacked with the global warming rubbish of the 1980s. And it was, of course, hijacked for a political agenda. And so that's sort of the background for me. Now, out of this, I wrote... the first book I wrote was a very detailed book called The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science. And it had to be very detailed. I waited, by the way, 20 years to publish it because the public, this is part of the difficulty, the public get completely lost in the science. Only about 15% of the population are comfortable with science and numbers. And so, but I had to write the book with all of the footnoting and citations because the academics would find one fault and throw the whole thing out. Okay. Right. Now, then more recently, with the success of that book, and I can give you an idea. One lawyer read it and said it was a very good book, but a hard slog. So what I did was I effectively wrote an investigative journalism book, which is about 100 pages with no citations, but just the story. And it's called Human Caused Global Warming, the Biggest Deception in History, the Why, What, Where, When, and How It Was Achieved. And of course, one of the things that I knew would happen, Diamond, is that as people started to realize that this was a scam, they would start to ask, well, why would scientists do this? Why would they be corrupted? What was the motive behind all of this? And of course, that's what the book explains for people.
Well, that's why I stepped up to the plate, Dr. Ball. Yep. And if you don't mind, can I call you Tim?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome.
No, the only reason we need the qualifications is because whenever I'm on, people say, well, how are you qualified to talk about this? But they never ask the same thing of Al Gore.
So this is the interesting thing. I came on the air less than a year ago. I'm a exiled paleoclimatologist because I happened to get into my graduate career during the peak of global warming. I could barely scrape a few $1,000s from the state to do my research because my research was on climate cycles and we were heading into a cooling phase and they just didn't want to hear that. And my investigation was based on historical documentation, science, the gift to ice cores, and the data that I was collecting in the field.
But and by the way, just to put that in perspective, I had the privilege in the very early years. I did my PhD at London, England, because of course there were no schools of climatology. Well, I should qualify that. There were only two schools of climatology in the world at that time. One was, of course, the Climatic Research Unit that Hubert Lamb set up at East Anglia, and that became famous later on because the scientists there became corrupted and bought into the whole global warming nonsense. The other school was at Wisconsin under Reed Bryson, and so these were the only two schools of climate in those early days. And it was talking with Lamb where I came to realize, and by the way, he was a forecaster, as was Bryson. Both of them were weather forecasters during the war and had the same experience, that the forecasts they were doing were so terribly wrong. And Lamb said the bomber pilots were coming back from over Germany and said, you almost killed us because you told us it was clear sky and we hit rain and freezing rain and everything else. And so he vowed after the war was over to start looking at the long-term climate record. And so this is what you tapped into. And yes, nobody wanted to look at long-term records or recreate them. Everybody was into, you got to come up with some new theory, even if you have no facts. And so that was what you became part of. It's a very difficult situation. And if you didn't do what the academics and the prevailing wisdom wanted, you just simply didn't get any funding or get listened to at all, because it had already, the discipline had already been hijacked by the bureaucrats at the national weather offices like NOAA and the UKMO and so on. And of course, that was done deliberately. This became, it was the first fake news and the first deep state operation that's been going on for 40 years now. So yeah, you're very, very much a part of that whole pattern. By the way, just to put things in perspective for you as well, there was a conference around 1990, and it was a bizarre conference in that the people that were there, half of them were from the West, America, Britain, and so on, and the other half were from the Soviet Union, as it was then, and from China. And what was interesting at the conference was that the Chinese and the Soviets were saying, look, the climate is cyclical. We got very long-term records, and all you got to do is figure out what the major cycles are and how they interact to end up with the net weather from which you can then make better forecasts. The West at that time was totally into chaos theory. that the weather is chaotic and therefore unpredictable. And I used to tease them at the time and said, you better hope you're right, because that'll give you an excuse for why your forecasts are so wrong. So you came into the middle of that dispute, and what was interesting was the mainstream media reported this as a political difference, when in fact it was a very fundamental scientific difference, as you learned and experienced in your research.
Yeah, absolutely fundamental.
Yep.
Now, in my recent research, so this is the irony, because actually, the same thing you just said, when you start to espouse the truth about the climate and the scientific narrative that is true based on data, they start checking your credentials. Yep. Now, I have several papers published back in 1993, 94, 95. Not a single person had looked at them in academia, on ResearchGate, on the internet ever for 23 years. And they've been scrutinized now over 480 times in the last 6 months. Is that insane?
Well, it is insane, but of course it is the bias that was occurring in society. I mean, look at the difference from when you started, and certainly from when I started at the university. It was the old professors that held the prevailing wisdom. That's why I went and talked to people like Hubert Lamb, and I also, by the way, had some phone conversations with Bryson, because we didn't have email at that time. But it was the old professors had the prevailing wisdom, and the new young people came in and challenged those. Now it's exactly the opposite. Now the young people come out of the school system totally indoctrinated, and it's us old people, and you look at Fred Singer at 92 and myself and all of the people that are the so-called skeptics and deniers. We're the ones that are saying, hey, hold on a minute, science isn't settled. Why are you so rigid in your science? So they've turned the whole thing completely upside down.
Yeah, when I was in academia, there was no such thing as settled science. That's why we had conferences annually. It was continuously changing and migrating. And then it started to get compartmentalized, and the chemists and the geologists were separated, and then the physicists, and they couldn't talk to each other. And here we are today with complete science fiction. I mean, the evidence is out. There is no such thing as dark matter. There is no such thing as black holes. And there is no such thing as global warming. And yet that's all we hear on the media.
Yeah,
nonsense.
Well, exactly, and of course they're referring to this, and I hate the phrase postmodern. It's actually modern ignorance, not postmodern anything. But facts don't matter anymore, and of course that's what happened at the Climatic Research Unit at East Anglia. I mean, I saw the hostility that the people that had taken over from Lamb, particularly led by Tom Wigley, I mean, they openly derided him. But he was still going to work every day, because he said, look, until you've got historic records and data, you haven't got a hope of understanding what the mechanisms of weather and climate are. But they move beyond that. But this is a very important thing we need to talk about, Diamond, is that, and I pin this down to the year 1859, and I'll explain why that's significant in a minute. But
the Carrington event.
Well, the Carrington event, but also it was the year that Darwin's Origin of Species was published.
Yes.
But also it was the year in which Alexander von Humboldt died. All right. Now, one of the things that has occurred, and what you're referring to in your comments just now, is that we've gone from a world in which there were general rules and there were exceptions to the rule, and now we're into a world where everything is an exception to the rule. And therefore, what we end up with is we've moved from generalized overviews of things so that you've got a general understanding to specialization, where we've got this enormously complex puzzle of the environment and climate, and everybody's got one piece of the puzzle, but no, we've lost the box top. And that's the difficulty. Climatology, as you and I studied it and tried to study it, is a generalist discipline. Now, the reason that I pin 1850...
Multidisciplinary. Multidisciplinary.
The only other people that understand what the problem is, if you get anybody that's done systems analysis research, then they understand that it's a complex thing, and what you need to understand are the individual pieces, but how they all interact together. So systems analyst people understand the problem, but systems analysis only developed because learning had broken up into so many small specialized pieces. And the analogy that I used to use for my students, I still do for the public, is that, you've got the patient lying on the table, and the one podiatrist is looking at the feet, and the nephrologist is looking at the kidneys, and the neurosurgeon's looking at the brain, and the nurse in the corner who's trying to care for the entire patient is saying, "But doctors, the patient's dead." That's the problem that we've got ourselves into. So people come along with call themselves climate scientists, and notice that distinction between a climatologist and a climate scientist. And in the one lawsuit that I've won so far, I made a very long point before the judge of explaining what the difference was. And a climate scientist, of course, is somebody who's in one's very specialized area. For example, all they do is look at atmospheric gases, for example, or maybe only CO2, and they say, this is the important piece of the puzzle, fund me, this is the key to everything. But then they never put it into the larger picture, which of course must be done if you're going to finish the puzzle. And one of the things I've argued, Diamond, is that we haven't even got the corner pieces for the climate puzzle. We haven't got the oceans, we haven't got the land surfaces, we haven't got the atmosphere, we haven't got deep space. Those four corner pieces are not even properly understood. And as anybody knows that does a puzzle, the first thing you got to do is get the corner pieces in place.
Yeah, so one of the main corner pieces was emerging in the early 90s, and it was the lag time behind CO2 and temperature when we were looking at the GISP-2. And it showed about 800-year lag time. And then the whole global warming funding issue arose. So I went to the statistical analysis team at Temple. They were doing, Fourier analysis was new, and we were studying different data sets. And I went to them and we talked about, is it even possible to prove that man could have an anthropogenic effect on climate? And we don't even have enough data. Simply knowing that there's an 800-year lag time in CO2 following temperature in the recent million years of Earth's history, there is no way that we could determine anthropogenic effect looking at 200 years of data. It's complete nonsense. It's a farce. It's not science. And you can prove it statistically that it isn't. And I don't know why no one is screaming this, because they started to in the 90s, but it quickly got crushed.
Well, when the first ice core records came out, and at the time, and I had been working with Fritz Kerner, who was a British glaciologist doing ice cores, and he'd moved to Canada and was working with the government of Canada, and he was one of the few people that ever did ice cores in Antarctica and in the Arctic. And I was working with him in the late 70s and early 80s, and he was getting ice cores off of Baffin Island and in the high Arctic. And he said, what my sampling shows that the temperature is changing before the CO2, not as being as being argued. So this is back in the 80s. Now, it came to the global attention in 1991. And then reinforced again in 1994 when the French scientists Petit and Jouzel brought forward those first Arctic or Antarctic ice cores. And one of the French scientists, and I remember the public presentation of this, the press release of this, Jouzel, by the name of Jouzel, and he said, "Look, don't rush to judgment on this. It takes 70 years for each bubble in the ice to get absorbed, And then, of course, we've smoothed the average, or we've smoothed the individual year record out by a 70-year smoothing average. So we've taken most of the diagnostic detail out of the statistics. And he said, not only that, but you're looking at a graph that represents about 10 centimeters on a page, but it's 400,000 years of history. And of course, within 5 years, Fisher and others showed exactly what you showed, that the temperature changed before the CO2, as Fritz Kerner had been telling me 10 years earlier. And by the way, it isn't just 800-year lag. It's anywhere from 80 to 800 years. The lag time varies. And I have looked at every single temperature CO2 record. In every case, the temperature precedes the CO2. And the length of time that it varies also varies. Most of the record, for example, the 90,000-year record of CO2 readings taken in the 19th century, the temperature precedes the CO2 change by 6 years. And Ernst Beck showed that with very detailed studies. So, but here's the point about this, and here we're back to the public not understanding scientific method. I was invited to appear before the Canadian Parliamentary Committee on the ozone issue. Now, I said to them, look, I'm not an expert in ozone. I don't know why you're asking me. But I realized afterwards that I was the only one that was questioning the science that they were doing. I wasn't questioning what they were actually saying, the results, because the results were only as good as the scientific methods they were using to apply to it, and those were rubbish. But so anyway, I went to Ottawa, and and I should tell you, by the way, the CFC holes in the ozone issue was a trial run for the CO2 issue. The same people that were involved later in the IPCC were key players in the CFC holes in the ozone issue. One of the key people I'll name right now is Susan Solomon. And Susan Solomon was an atmospheric chemist at NOAA. And she was the one that said she had proof that CFCs were in the ozone layer, causing destruction of the ozone. She never had that proof at all. There was never, ever any empirical evidence to prove that was true. She later went on to become a co-editor of the IPCC reports. And so, and I'll get back to this because this is very important, but what you had was these bureaucratic scientists who latched on to these ideas and saw a career and a political agenda with them, and they pushed them. But anyway, so I appear before this Canadian Parliamentary Committee. Well, guess the groups that were there. There were 5 people from DuPont who produced the CFC.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, oh, yeah. Okay.
Monsanto sitting behind them.
Well, yeah, but you know what? DuPont, they never said a word. They didn't say anything. They didn't even make a presentation. They just sat there, and I couldn't figure it out. And I spoke to them afterwards, and I said, look, you guys know this science is rubbish. And they just smiled. Well, of course, the answer was that their patent was running out on the CFCs, and so they were going to lose control of it. And so it was to their advantage to have it shown as causing a problem with the ozone. And they were the only company that had already developed a replacement, the HCFCs, which turned out to be worse than the CFCs. Okay, so that's why they were silent. Now, there was also a group representing, there were, as I recall, 7 of them, representing Friends of the Earth. And this is another part of this whole environmental rubbish. And as I pointed out to the Parliament, to the politicians, look at the title, Friends of the Earth. What they're saying is, if you're not in our group, you're not a friend of the Earth. How dare they? And I said, I've spoken to them. None of them have even an hour of training at the university level in anything to do with atmospheric physics. So they're pure emotion. They don't know what you're talking about. But they get more time, and there's more of them than the 3 scientists that you brought forward here. Now, one of the scientists was from York University, and he started showing slides, and he was showing graphs of he said, here's the level of ozone over Toronto, Canada in 1996, and he actually had several years of it, but he showed the 1996 graph, and he said, this is the lowest level of ozone over Toronto in 1996. I'm sitting there, and I knew that there were no readings of ozone over Toronto in the 1996 or any other year. And so I stopped and I said, do you realize, I said, I hope I never have to do this again, but I hope you realize that this is not real data. What this guy's presenting to you is computer model simulations. There are no readings over Toronto in 1996. Well, of course, I realized that basically went right over their heads. So he finished his presentation. And then when I was up to present, and I don't know if you've ever appeared before parliamentary or congressional committees. Yeah. I've done 2 congressional committees and 2 Canadian parliamentary committees, but you must always submit your paper with ahead of time, and you must present what you presented in your paper. And of course, it gives them time then to make the political hay they want to out of your presentation. And it's why now I just, in fact, when the ozone people, they called me on the ozone issue, I refused to go, and they sent me a message saying, this is a quasi-judicial body, and if you don't show up, we'll throw you in jail. And so I said, look, I don't care if you throw me in jail. I'm going to throw out my presentation, and I'm going to explain to you the scientific method. Now, this is the whole point of this story. Most of the public don't understand what the scientific method is. The scientific method is that you create a hypothesis. You say that which is then based on assumptions, so that you say, if this is true and this is true and this is true, then this could happen. All right, but what happens? Test it. Then you test it, exactly. And of course, the point I was making to them was, look, here you've got a theory about CFCs destroying ozone as a hypothesis or speculation as in the vernacular. And I said, it's never been tested. It's never been proven. And of course, that's the same thing as the whole CO2 causing warming. And I remember Richard Lindzen back it was in Discover magazine, I believe it was 1990, in the early 1990s anyway, shortly before he quit the IPCC, he came out and said, look, the consensus was reached before the research had even begun. And that was the only consensus that was that got traction. And of course, it ended up with that 97% consensus argument, which was absolute proof that these people didn't have a clue what they were talking about, because their consensus does not apply to science whatsoever. There's no way. But
I never even heard of that until the global warming scare. But I will let me clear up some ozone information for you. I don't know if you know the recent science. I do, because I've been studying heavily on the cutting edge of climate science. I believe the major factor here in climate is cosmic rays, and it's driven by the sun and the solar cycle.
Okay, Diamond, let me stop you for a minute. Yeah. I'm aware of that. In fact, I just had communication with Svensmark, who was the guy brought forward this cosmic theory. Okay, he sent me a copy of his draft proposal, and I said, this is a very interesting idea, because it tackles one of the biggest problems that we've had. We've known for decades, and the Chinese for centuries, that there is a correlation between the number of sunspots and temperature on the Earth. But correlation is not cause and effect. And so the IPCC were able to reject what Svensmark was doing. And in fact, in 2001, when he published the first stuff on that. So, I'm very familiar with all of that. But here's the thing. What I pointed out to the Canadian Parliamentary Committee on the ozone issue is that ozone is created by ultraviolet radiation from the sun, which interacts with the ozone in a process called photodisassociation. So when the ultraviolet hits the ozone particle, it breaks it up from 3 oxygen molecules from 2 oxygen molecules into individual oxygen molecules. Those individual oxygen molecules combine with an O2. So that makes O3, which is ozone. In other words, the ozone is created by ultraviolet radiation. But they start with the assumption that ultraviolet radiation from the sun is constant. And you also know that in studies of the sun, they refer to it as the solar constant. It is not constant. Astrophysicists like Willie Soon, who I've worked with, and Sally Baliunas and so on, they tell you the sun is a variable star. Now, we now know that the variation in ozone is caused by variation in ultraviolet radiation. But if you assume that ultraviolet radiation is constant, as they did with their hypothesis about CFCs causing ozone destruction, then you're almost forced to assume, well, then it must be something coming from below. And here's now why they make the parallel with what went on with the CO2. Sherwood and there were 2 guys in California, Sherwood and Moland, or I've forgotten his last name, but there were 2 of them. What they did was they had ozone in a jar in a laboratory, and they put CFCs in the jar, and it killed the ozone. But the problem with that is that does not simulate what is going on in the ozone layer, where you've got temperatures of down to minus 90 and colder Celsius, and you've also got virtually no atmospheric pressure. And therefore, you cannot simulate those conditions, and they did not simulate those conditions in the lab, but they said, oh yeah, we've got scientific proof that CFCs destroy ozone. It was absolute rubbish, but they got a Nobel Prize for that. This is another of these this is the preceding of the whole CO2 issue. So this is why I'm saying to you that the CFC and holes in the ozone. And notice, by the way, the PR value. There are no holes in the ozone. There never was a hole in the ozone. There are areas of thinning of the ozone, and it happens to be thinnest over Antarctica. But it's thinnest because there is no sunlight or UV in the wintertime. And then the mixing of the very strong mixing of the southern hemisphere with the very strong geostrophic winds of the jet stream and so on are what caused that lower levels of ozone over the Antarctic. And so, as I said, when you start to look at the basic science of all of that, it's absolute rubbish, as is the whole thing on CO2 and global warming.
Well, what the new science, Tim, on the ozone depletion is exactly what you said, but there are some new papers coming out of all places, Ontario, Canada, Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Waterloo, where QV...
Chinese guy. Yeah, I quoted him.
He correlated cosmic rays with the depletion in the Antarctic zone. So what you have is you have low solar activity, which creates ozone in that area, and high cosmic ray induced flux, which causes the halogenated molecules, which play the dominant role in causing ozone holes or depletion, to be charged. So it's electron-induced reactions through cosmic rays.
Hang on, Diamond. Here's the problem I have with that, and I'm very aware of that paper. I remember when it first came out. But the problem is that the cosmic rays vary, as does the solar UV level vary in concert with each other. They're all related to changes in the sun. and particularly with the magnetic field. Now, the one energy issue that's been overlooked in all of this is magnetism. I happen to think that water and magnetism are going to become the two most focused issues in the 21st century as we learn more about them. As you know, Einstein, after he published the theory of relativity, got off into that unified field theory where he tried to come up with an explanation, a general theory that combined magnetism, electricity, and gravity. And as I said, it was called the unified field theory. Now, he's never fully done that, but as I said, this was the debate or discussion I had with Svensmark about his theory. Now, as I said, it was helpful because now we had a mechanism that could show that as the cosmic rays come past the sun, the amount that gets past and through the sun's magnetic field varies with the strength of that sun's magnetic field. As they enter the atmosphere, as Svensmark showed, the cosmic rays don't become condensation nuclei until they get into the lower atmosphere. So they only correlate with levels of low cloud in the atmosphere. Now, one of the big scandals that went on with this, and again, I've talked with Svensmark. In fact, as I said, just the other day, I communication with him. What they needed was proof that the cosmic ray, once it got into the lower atmosphere, did become a condensation nuclei. Now, for your listeners, that without these dust particles and particles in the atmosphere, condensation simply can't occur. That is, that water cannot change from a gas, water vapor, into a liquid, a water droplet. And this is we knew back when I started doing all this research that there were not enough condensation nuclei in the atmosphere to explain all of the cloud formation. We knew that the major source of condensation nuclei were two things. One was clay particles, particularly the smallest particles of clay. Clay breaks down, or soil breaks down into clay, which is the smallest particles of soil, and there are three types. There's illite, montmorillonite, and kaolinite. Now, kaolinite are the smallest particles of clay that are carried up into the atmosphere, and they become condensation nuclei because they are what they call hygroscopic. That is, they attract water vapor. And by the way, kaolinite, people know that name from kaolin, which of course is kaopectate, which is what you take when you got diarrhea because you're eating clay particles and it absorbs the water out of your system that stops the diarrhea. Kaolinite is also the basis of the finest bone china because it absorbs and can hold 18 times its own weight in water, and therefore it makes extremely fine and very strong, thin clay. So kaolin is a very, very important mineral in the atmosphere, and as I said, it was a major source of condensation nuclei. The second largest source of nuclei that we knew about was salt particles. And one of the ways I learned about this before I went back to studying the full meteorology and climatology was that when we were doing our patrols over the North Atlantic, most of our patrols were at 1,000 feet over the water or lower. We would do 18-hour patrols in the aircraft, and when we came back and landed, we had to go right into a hangar where the aircraft was completely washed down because it was fully encrusted with salt. And yet all we'd done was fly over the ocean. And so we knew that these salt particles and the kaolin, but even with that, there weren't enough of those particles to explain all the cloud cover. Of course, Svensmark's theory provides that answer. It provides these particles, but he had to have proof that they did become condensation nuclei, and that had to be done at the particle accelerator at Geneva, the CERN, CERN, and of course,
the cloud experiment basically proved that.
Okay, now what happened was, and you can check with Svensmark on yourself on this. I talked about it just the other day. He sent the stuff there to have it tested. He waited for 2 years and heard nothing. And it finally came out. The director of CERN said that he'd had political pressure not to release the results. Okay, this is how much the corruption has gone on. And he eventually did have to come out and say, yeah, these cosmic rays do convert into condensation nuclei in the lower atmosphere and therefore can become the basis of cloud formation. But Svensmark said that he had to really chase them down, and he said it was only because this director of CERN, who he threatened to expose, and the political pressure that was going on, finally came out and said, okay, yeah, I'll acknowledge it. But it was more than 2 years before that became confirmed. Now, in the meantime, of course, the IPCC, who didn't acknowledge what Svensmark was saying, only did so in the most recent report of 2013, but they still don't include that in their computer models.
No.
Right? So it really becomes meaningless. And so there's so many stories behind all of this stuff. And the condensation nuclei and that whole thing is just part of it. And that's by the way why I didn't communicate directly with the Chinese. I can't pronounce his name, but I was very aware of his work, and I did write articles saying to people, look, be careful, because yeah, you might be seeing a correlation, but you're not providing a full cause and effect relationship, and it might be something else, and that's the whole danger in climate studies, as you know. And this is what Lam and I talked about this at great length. And we also talked about things like how do you define when a particular warming or cooling period starts and ends. And Lam, as you know, Lam was the guy that created the term medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age. And as I said, I spent hours with him talking about it, because the research I was doing was reconstructing research that was well into the Little Ice Age, but then carried through to what he and I agreed was the end of the Little Ice Age in the middle of the 20th, or towards the end of the 20th century. But he also pointed out to me, and this never got into the literature, that but they argued that the medieval warm period didn't exist because it wasn't uniform across the globe. Well, Lam and I discussed the fact that the onset or the decline of the medieval warm period, depending on how you defined it, could differ up to 100 years from one region to another based upon local and regional conditions. So this is another part of the whole story. But if I could go back to the 18th...
the temperature change was still 3 degrees C when it got cold into the Little Ice Age.
Yes, it was. But here's the difficulty with it. As you know, and this is another whole part of this story, when you've got instrumental records, and it just, to me, it's absolutely laughable when they talk about, oh, well, and I wrote an article about this just the other day that got published on What's Up With That. The blade of the hockey stick, which Phil Jones produced, was a reconstruction of global temperatures from instrumental data from about 1860 up to 1950, so about 120 years. And he claimed the temperature had increased by 0.6 degrees Celsius in that 120 years. And he said that was outside of any normal increase in temperature, which is absolute rubbish. But what he also, and it is in the IPCC report, but everybody ignored it except me, it was 0.6 degrees Celsius plus or minus 0.2 degrees Celsius. In other words, it was a 33% plus or minus error factor. And so when you go from, whenever you hear a temperature that is anything other than 0.0 at the end or 0.5 at the end, it is a statistic. It is not an actual measurement, because even though, and I watched this change occur where we went from mercury thermometers to spirit thermometers to thermocouples. Yes, you can measure temperature to thousandths of a degree now, but you can't use that in the record because the early temperature record was only accurate to half a degree. And so in the instrumental record, anything that is outside of half a degree. Look at Anthony Watts's study of American weather stations, the most detailed study of any weather stations in the world, and the Americans have the best, most dense network of weather stations, and he found that only 8% or just under 9% of those stations were accurate to greater than 1 degree Celsius. So when they start talking about it being 0.1 degrees Celsius warmer this year and that year, but it's absolute nonsense, total unadulterated rubbish, and yet they keep on doing it. But when you get back into the proxy record, which of course you and I are very, very familiar with, that is the secondary indicators of temperature change and climate change, and there's a whole range of them. And this is why I was so angry about the misuse of tree ring data for the hockey stick. Tree rings, for the most part, by that I mean at least 97%, and I did an awful lot of work with the tree rings with people at Churchill up on Hudson Bay, Peter Scott and others, and the tree rings represent precipitation, not temperature. And
exactly.
And that's another part of the myth of the rewriting of history using proxy data. The beauty of tree rings, of course, was that they spanned from the instrumental record back to the proxy record. And I hear the music, so I'll stop talking.
Yeah, we're going to go to break for 5 minutes, put it on mute, and we'll be right back. We're going to talk about the sun. We're going to talk about the waning magnetosphere. We're going to talk about real climate science with Dr. Tim Ball. And stay tuned, guys. Awesome conversation happening right now. Thanks, Tim.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Enter into a world unseen on Raven Star's Witching Hour. You will encounter eclectic topics from the realm of spirit brought into our matrix of truth. With your host, the Solaris Blue Raven. Solaris will bring you an array of unique guests covering topics from ghostly spirits to amazing anomalies, covert technology, UFOs, and shadowy global events.
And that's right here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, Saturdays midnight till 2 a.m. Eastern Time. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
Let the magic rise.
Join me weekdays for my new show, Tell Chris Joe. It's going to be a problem show brought to you live from Kensington. Thursdays, I'm dealing with hot topics, heated debate, what's new around the world, and ring-ins to discuss listeners' problems and offering considered and heartfelt solutions. So join me, Chris Hart, for Tell Chris Joe. Stop what you're doing, grab a cup of tea. I'm coming live from Kensington. Relax, let me entertain you with a coffee bar online. Listeners' very personal problems. So that's Thursdays, 2 p.m. in the afternoon, Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. See you there. It's going to be lots of fun.
This is Barbara DeLong, host of Nightlight Radio, inviting you to join me on a cosmic journey, exploring a metaphysical montage of spiritual material, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between, including spiritual readings for those who seek enlightenment. Let Nightlight provide you with equal measure of light, love and laughter, insight, wisdom, and inspiration. Monday nights, 10 to 12 p.m. Eastern, right here on Studio B, Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Good evening, folks. It's Diamond with the Oppenheimer Ranch Project. We're back for the second half of the Inconvenient Truth, prepping for the Grand Solar Minimum with our guest, Dr. Tim Ball. He is the author of The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science. I suggest you go get the Kindle edition. It's less than $10. And all of his books get 4.5 stars or more. That's got to be a good book. And his most recent book, Human-Caused Global Warming, the biggest deception in history, the why, what, where, and when, and how it was achieved by Dr. Tim Ball. You can get the Kindle edition right now for $5.99. Just put it on Google and go there. You're going to save $6 on the list price. I suggest you get the paperback because at some point in the future, it is my belief that the grid will start to fail catastrophically due to the waning magnetosphere and the output of the sun causing a Carrington-like event to start to crumble our infrastructure. Now, this is based on new plasma science, plasma physics, the electric universe theory, and those that are listening, you know what I'm talking about. We are called observers because we are going against the mainstream of science because science has been corrupted. It is corrupted by the globalist cabal that has now coupled with multinational corporations to run the world and to basically pollute it to their profit. And they don't really care about humanity in any way. I'm sure Tim believes a small amount of what I'm saying. Tim, can you corroborate that what I'm saying is true?
Well, I can corroborate that exactly what you're saying is true. But you see here, then this is another part of the story. And by the way, I do want to get back to 1859, but I'll speak to what you're talking about right now because this is very crucial. See, one of the ways that they meaning the people that are proposing the whole global warming scam, they marginalize you by personal attacks. And those, of course, I'm getting with the lawsuits and so on. And then through sites like Dismogblog, which, by the way, is funded by and was created and funded by James Hogan. And James Hogan is the chairman of the David Suzuki Foundation, which is one of the biggest environmental groups in Canada. And Hogan also owns one of the biggest PR companies in Canada, Hogan and Associates. And of course, he has all of his clients are people that benefit from proving that CO2 is a problem. And this is what's amusing about this is that if you say, well, CO2 isn't a problem, oh, you're being funded by the energy oil companies, which in my case is absolutely a lie. I wish it was true because then I could afford their product. But somehow, if you're funded by Greenpeace or by something, an alternate energy company, that's not directed or guided funding. And this is all part of the thing. Now, as I said, if they can't marginalize you and attack you individually and shut you up, and of course, this is what they did with the first lawsuit. And then when I didn't shut up, they brought the second lawsuit. When I still didn't shut up, they brought the third lawsuit. But they will, and I don't know if this is a contradiction in ideas, but they will create groups. And when I say contradiction of ideas, it's collective ad hominems. And I don't know if that's a contradiction in ideas, but for example, if you dare to even ask a question about Obama's paperwork, you were immediately dubbed a birther. And this is a very, very clever way of saying, oh, you're one of those birthers, which then means you're immediately marginalized in the public mind as being outside of mainstream thinking and therefore not to be listened to. With the climate issue, it started out by being a global warming skeptic. And then people like me and Fred Singer and Richard Lindzen and so on started pointing out that all scientists are skeptics. If you're not a skeptic, you're not a scientist.
Exactly.
Right. And they still kept calling us that. They only stopped calling us that in around 2004. And this is very telling because, of course, we weren't opposed to the idea that the Earth was warming. The world had been warming since 1980, and it certainly warmed up till about 1998. Nobody was arguing that. What we were saying was that their explanation that the warming was caused by human CO2 was not right. Okay, but they, of course, said, "Oh no, you're opposed to the whole global warming issue." No, we're not. We're opposed to your explanation.
CO2 is off the charts, Tim, and the temperature has dropped 0.5 degrees in the last 7 months.
Exactly, but okay, but here's the problem. You see, from the time they started the global warming thing in 1990, CO2 levels were going up, and temperature was going up until 1998, and then CO2 levels continued to rise because the one thing you probably haven't heard, and most people haven't thought about yet, is they're in control of the atmospheric level of CO2 in the atmosphere that's produced by the IPCC. Okay, we can talk about that later. But anyway,
they are now taken over by the World Wildlife Foundation.
Of course.
So they're now completely a nonsense group of non-scientists.
Exactly. But anyway, what happened after 1998 was the temperature. We had an El Nino year, but then the temperature started to go down, and by 2004. You were getting very cold, record colds and severe snowstorms and so on, that even the public were starting to say, well, you know, you're talking about global warming, but where's all this cold coming from? Well, this was in emails leaked from the Climatic Research Unit, that corrupt agency. They had a discussion about this in 2004, where the guy that was in charge of the public relations of the corruption, by the name of at the Men's Tyndall Center, I've forgotten his name now, but he wrote an email to the Swedish climate representative on the IPCC and said, look, this is becoming an increasingly hard sell. I think we should stop calling it global warming and start calling it climate change. And Yellen, who was the Swedish expert on the IPCC, said, I agree with you. And that's what they did. They stopped calling it global warming and started calling it climate change. But, and by the way, some of the public picked up on that. Some of the media picked up on that, but they brushed it all aside. And of course, then what they did was they stopped calling us global warming skeptics and started calling us climate change deniers, with all of the Holocaust connotations of that. So the collective ad hominems continued. And of course now, if you're a denier, you're threatened with lawsuits. It was just absolutely unbelievable how people who know nothing about it are talking about things they know nothing about and claiming that we're criminals. In fact, as you know, Gore organized through 24 of the attorney generals of the U.S. states lawsuits with Senator Whitehouse, a RICO, racketeering lawsuits against climate change deniers.
It's like the Inquisition, man.
Oh yeah, but it's worse. It's worse because presumably we've advanced into the 21st century, but the reality is we haven't. And so this is what has been going on, so all of these things are explainable, why they make the changes they do. But of course, you see, this is why I'm such a threat to them. One, they couldn't say I wasn't qualified, although they tried to, and Dismogblog tried to say I wasn't qualified. And then, of course, they try to put it down because they said, oh, well, he claims he's a climatologist, and which means, oh, you're not a mathematician or a physicist, like somehow you don't know, and so they tried to deride that. Now they've stopped doing that. But Dismogblog, as I said, was deliberately set up. I mean, can you imagine a website designed to attack people that are seeking the truth? But that's what they do. And as I said, that's who's funding it. Now, one of the people...
Hey, Tim.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I just want to jump in and ask a question about, we keep talking about these people and them in this position of trying to quiet the voice of reality. Yeah. What was, from your looking at it over these years, what is the primary purpose for them wanting to have this narrative out there? What is the fundamental reason? I know a lot of people, like you said, a lot of companies have jumped on board and back it because it's helpful to their bottom line, but it probably didn't start out that way. What is, if you go all the way back to the most corrupt component of this whole narrative?
Scott, I think it goes back to Margaret Thatcher. It is a globalist agenda. It is a fear issue that can put the nationalistic boundaries away and make everyone come together to solve a problem as one government.
Okay,
Tim?
hang on a minute, Diamond. That's a very, very good question that Scott asked. But let me fill you in on this. Now, Margaret Thatcher was the first person to identify CO2 as possibly causing global warming. And the person that was on her science advisory committee is a guy by the name of Lord Monckton.
Yeah, Monckton.
Okay, now Monckton, of course...
On our side now.
Exactly. Okay, and let me tell you an interesting little story. At the first Heartland conference in New York, and I was sitting at a table at lunchtime. There were 8 of us around the table, and Monckton was there. And
this is 96.
Yes. Okay, and Monckton was there, and the other people got up and left the table to go and get their lunch at the buffet. And I said to Monckton, I said, weren't you involved with Thatcher in showing that CO2 was causing global warming? And he got very angry. And he first denied it. And I said, look, I'm not blaming you for anything. You've changed your mind, and good for you. And Thatcher's changed her mind. But you were involved originally in it. In other words, you were the first people to use the climate for a political agenda. And I said,
$1 billion agenda.
Oh, yeah. Now, why did Thatcher do that? And this gets back to Scott's original question, and I'll elaborate on that in a minute. Thatcher was the whole of England was being literally controlled by the Coal Miners' Union. And that was run by a fellow who declared himself president of the Coal Miners' Union for life. All right. And he was threatening to cripple the whole country. And so Thatcher wanted to undermine the Coal Miners' Union, but she also wanted to produce or to switch from coal to atomic energy. But atomic energy was a very hard sell because of 3 Mile Island and the Chernobyl incident. And so what she did was she got Monckton and a few other scientists to show that CO2 caused warming, and CO2 was produced by coal and fossil fuels, and therefore what you needed was an atomic power, nuclear power, as the replacement. Now, of course, Britain's at the point where those nuclear power stations need to be replaced, and there's a big battle going on about that again. But as I said, I'll give Monckton and Thatcher credit that they did change their minds later and publicly said so. Now,
but let me ask a question then.
Yeah.
So did it get further hijacked at that point? Did they give up the ball and somebody else say, hey, this is a pretty nice ball that I can use beyond this,
yes,
Great Britain
yes.
need? So who picked up the ball after that and then continued it?
That's again a very, very good question. One of the key people that was involved in that transition was a fellow by the name of John Houghton, Houghton, who was head of the United Kingdom Met Office. And he believed that industry was a sin and that therefore CO2 and the production of CO2 was a sin. And it wasn't that he wasn't qualified. He was a scientist who had studied CO2. But he was also publishing articles in scientific or in religious journals. Now, he's entitled to his religious view, but don't let Amen. But don't let it color your science. Okay, but that's what he did. Now, at the same time that all of this was going on, there was a group called the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome involved people like Mikhail Gorbachev, Ted Turner, and others, and a guy by the name of Maurice Strong, and they were looking at the idea that Malthus had created back in the 19th century. Thomas Malthus had said that the world population would outgrow the food supply. Now, he was absolutely wrong on that, but that was what he proposed. And to show you the influence of Malthus, Darwin took Malthus's book with him on his voyage on the Beagle, out of which he produced The Origin of the Species. So this idea of populations outgrowing their resources and survival of the fittest and one group dominating another group was all part of the whole Darwinian theory. Now, what the Club of Rome did was they took those ideas and they said, the world population will outgrow all of the resources, not just food supply. And we have, therefore, to reduce the number of people on Earth. The world's overpopulated. The Club of Rome commissioned work like the stuff by Paul Ehrlich. And Paul Ehrlich wrote the book, The Population Bomb, published in 1972, and go back, and it's the 50th anniversary, of course, of his production of that, but go back and look at his predictions. They're so wrong, it's unbelievable. The world is not overpopulated by any stretch of the imagination. And I'll just give you one example. Canada, the second largest country in the world, has the same population as California. I rest my case. But anyway, what the Club of Rome did was they said...
Wait, Tim. Food production is 1.6 times the population. We throw out a huge amount of food.
Exactly. And in fact, we produce enough food. When I calculated back in the 1990s, we were producing enough food to feed 26 billion people. 60%, and this was back to the CFC issue, you see. 60% of the food we produce never makes it to the table in developed countries. How have we reduced from 60 down to 30% loss? Through refrigeration. And when I appeared before that parliamentary committee, I said, we created the CFC so we could refrigerate our food and produce and prevent food loss. India and China are saying, hey, we want to produce CFCs and reduce our food loss. And we said, no, you can't do it. And they said, fine. We're not signing. We'll go along with the Montreal Protocol, but we're not signing it. So that was where it all started. But anyway, back to Paul Ehrlich. Now, Paul Ehrlich worked and published a book called Eco Science, Population, Resources, and Environment. His co-author with that was a fellow by the name of John Holdren. And John Holdren became Obama's science czar, sitting in the White House. And go and read the book that they published, that Eco Science. What they're doing in that book is talking about how you can, or the government's going to have to introduce forced abortions. It's absolutely incredible to read what they were saying we should do. But the idea was then that we need to reduce the population because each person on the planet is using up resources, and as they develop, they use up more and more resources. The population is continuing to grow, and the world's continuing to develop. Therefore, you're on a collision course with exhaustion of all the resources. So they commissioned a simplistic study called Limits to Growth. And in the limits to growth, they took what's the amount of resource we got now, what rate are we using it at, and then they projected using simple linear trends, we will run out of this resource in this year. Okay? And that was where the term that first got introduced was peak oil.
We have more oil in reserve now than ever before.
Well, of course. But you see, that was what they were pushing. Now, here's the thing. Maurice Strong, a Canadian who became a very wealthy American industrialist, and like all of these, so many of these very wealthy people, they feel guilt about it and decide they're going to save the planet. And you see that with George Soros, and you see it with all of them. Ted Turner is another one. And so what Maurice Strong, as a member of the United Nations or of the Club of Rome, and you could read about this in a very, very important book, which is almost impossible to get a hold of now. But Elaine Dewar, who was a Canadian investigative journalist, and we wish we had more of those these days, but she wanted to write a book praising Canadian environmentalists, like David Suzuki, like Elizabeth May, who's now the leader of the Green Party here in Canada, like our friend Maurice Strong. And she spent 5 days with Strong at the United Nations looking at what he was doing. And after she'd done her research, she determined that her original idea that these people were doing good things, that they were more corrupt and doing more harm than the people that they were attacking, that they were using environmental issues for a political agenda. And so one of the things that Dewar said to Strong, well, what's the problem with the world? And he said, the problem with the world are the industrialized nations, because they're using up resources at an unacceptable rate, and isn't it our responsibility to get rid of them? She then said to him, well, why don't you run for politics if that's what your agenda is? He then said probably the only honest thing he ever said in his lifetime, because he said, you can't do anything as a politician, right? And that comment, by the way, you hear only from people that are honest about politics. Conrad Black, who was a name some Americans would know about. Well, he was a very powerful person here in Canada. And they said to him one day, why aren't you in politics? And he said, I don't need to be. I mean, that is one of those comments that is an absolute, the more you think about it, the more of a bombshell it is. I don't need to be. Okay, so then Elaine Dewar said to Maurice Strong, well, how are you going to put these ideas of shutting down these industrialized nations into practice? And he said, well, I'm going to go to the United Nations because I can raise my own money from whomever I like, appoint anyone I want, and control the agenda. And that's precisely what he did. And he went to the United Nations and set up the United Nations Environment Program, out of which he created Agenda 21, which was formalized at the Rio Conference in 1992. All right. And he also at that point formalized the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was, of course, was to produce the science to show that CO2 was causing runaway global warming. In other words, it was designed to show that industry was the problem and that we had to shut down industry. And now that's one part of the story, but the other part of the story is, well, how could they narrow it down to CO2? If you look at if you stand outside and experience the weather, as we discussed in the first part of the program, you're experiencing everything from cosmic radiation in deep space, from heat off the bottom of the ocean, and everything in between. That's the weather. The climate is the average of that weather over time or in a region. And so, of course, the question then is, well, how do you narrow the focus to CO2? Well, let me switch again here, because this is again important, not just in terms of that, but also in terms of what's going on in our society. I used to think that commissions of inquiry were great things, because, finally we'll get the politics out of it. We'll have an independent inquiry. We'll get the politicians out of it. The very first commission of inquiry I got appointed to, I learned that, in fact, it gave her greater control to the politicians and the bureaucrats. And the reason it does this is because what the first commission I was appointed to was just a conflict over water in a lake in Canada, quite a large lake. And everybody was in disagreement about it. And of course, politicians, water is an issue people will shoot each other over. And so the politicians didn't want any part of it. So the minister in charge said, okay, we'll have a commission of inquiry. They asked me, because I was already teaching a course in water resources out of what I learned from my climate studies. And I said, yeah, I'll serve. Well, then we got the terms of reference for the commission to control the commission. We couldn't even get access to the data that we needed to do it. And so what I did was I told the chairman of the commission, Mr. Duncan, I said, you go back and tell the minister, unless we get access to everything, I'm going to go and tell the media that he's trying to predetermine the outcome of the commission. Well, that is, of course, what all commissions of inquiry do. And here's the beauty of it for the politician. The media can come and say, well, Mr. Politician, what about this? Oh, no, sorry, commission of inquiry, I can't comment till the report comes in. You see that going on in Washington right now. It's exactly what they're doing in Washington right now. And one of the things that brought this home to me when I was first learning about all of this was that I watched Chief Justice Warren, who was in charge of the Kennedy Assassination Commission. And you notice Bobby Kennedy's son is raising stories about this now. But Justice Warren was asked, well, why didn't you look at the mafia and the Dallas connection and Jack Ruby and all of that? And he simply said, it wasn't in my terms of reference. Well, I know that went over the head of most of the people listening, but I knew exactly what he was saying. The terms of reference said, don't go there. Well, guess what's the biggest conspiracy theory that's going around now? And of course, you see that term, if you dare to raise any, you're a conspiracy theorist. Well, sorry, it only needs two people to create a conspiracy. But you see, they're creating the idea, if it's a conspiracy theory, you're just a small group, and therefore you shouldn't be listened to. So all of this ties together in what has been going on. And so when Maurice Strong set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, he deliberately did it through the World Meteorological Organization. Now, the WMO is based in Geneva. It's a UN agency. It's got its own bureaucracy in Geneva, but most of the members and the people that control it are all the bureaucrats appointed by member nations of the UN. So, for example, the Americans from NOAA, they appoint the people to the WMO. So Maurice Strong knew that by using the WMO to create the IPCC, you put the total control of it in the hands of the bureaucrats, and the bureaucrats would then, of course, dictate to the politicians in every country. And if the politicians dared to question, then they could say, well, hey, we're your science experts. You hired us to do your weather studies for you. How dare you question us? What do you know about it? So Maurice Strong, and this is where, of course, he's created the deep state control of what's been going on with the whole IPCC thing. And by the way, and I've written articles about this. In the same year of 1992, when the Rio conference was held, and by the way, George Herbert Bush refused to go because he said, this is a socialist plan. I don't want any part of it. And he was absolutely right. But in 1992, that very same year, I just got to add one thing. When Dewar finished up, Elaine Dewar now, I'm talking about the one who wrote the book, Cloak of Green. After 5 days with Strong at the United Nations, she said, She wrote, Strong was using the UN as a platform to sell a global environment crisis and the global governance agenda. And she wrote that in 1990s. Okay, so there it is. It all is. That's what you've just been saying, Diamond. Now, in the same year that Strong created the IPCC and Agenda 21, he was appointed the chairman of Ontario Hydro. Now, in Canada, of course, we're a totally socialist country, and in each province, all of the energy in each province is totally controlled by one government-controlled agency. And they're called hydro, like we have BC Hydro, Saskatchewan Hydro. They're called hydro because in most Canadian provinces, the bulk of the electricity is produced by hydroelectric power. Canada is absolutely overwhelmed with energy. It's just, in the tar sands, for example, or bitumen sands, whatever you want to call them, in Alberta, there's more oil than all of the Middle East combined. And not only that, but there's more bitumen or tar sands underneath Saskatchewan than there is in Alberta. So, when you start talking about running out of oil. But anyway, in 1992, Strong was appointed chairman of Ontario Hydro. He introduced all of the proposals and plans that he wants the world to adopt, and which, of course, Obama and all the other countries of the world are introducing. That is to get rid of fossil fuels, replace them with alternate energies. Well, he did that in 1992. Ontario, which was the most prosperous province in Canada, is now receiving $1,200 per person per year because their economy has collapsed completely. They're taking money from the other wealthy provinces and funding these socialists whose economy has collapsed. And even if they start now changing their whole energy thing in Ontario, it's going to take a minimum of 40 years to get back to normal. And to give you an idea, a guy sent me a copy of his electricity bill or his hydro bill for the month. And he used 0 kilowatt hours because he was away for the whole month. His bill was $142 for 0 use of energy. That's how bad it's become. So right in Ontario, right across the border, you can see the application of what Maurice Strong and the Club of Rome and the United Nations want applied to the world and how it fails. So
and to just kind of wrap up my question, then, would you say at this point they have failed? They're losing. Are they losing momentum, and is that momentum? Is it slowing? Are they slowing down more and more as time goes on?
Yes, because another part of this. Sorry, I got a drink here. Another part of this, and there are so many things going on in society, all interacting with each other. It's like the cycles idea that Diamond and I talked about earlier. But society changes by a process called paradigm shifts. That is, every once in a while, a new idea comes forward called a paradigm, and people then look at it and say, yeah, that's got some merit. Maybe we should be doing things differently. Two of the most important ones in the 20th century, one of them was feminism, and of course, it was absolutely necessary that we changed how we dealt with women, and you see the rest of the world struggling with it, Saudi Arabia and so on. But the other one was, of course, the introduction of the environment. And one of the things that I've constantly fought is saying, look, I care about the environment as much as the rest of you. It was like at that ozone hearing where I said they call themselves friends of the earth, and they're saying if you're not a group with one of us, you don't care about the earth. How dare they? How dare they? The arrogance of that is just outrageous. Okay, but what happens with a new paradigm is that there's a small group of people that see the potential for power and money, and they grab the idea and exploit it for their own agenda. The majority of people are looking at it and saying, well, that sounds like a good idea. It has some merits. but they don't know how to adapt it. And of course, they're scared to adapt it because most people are afraid of change. And that's a very legitimate concern because change occurs all the time and everybody knows that. But they also know that whenever there's change, somebody wins and somebody loses and they don't know who it is. And it might just be them that lose. So they are very reluctant to adopt change. Now, how do they for the first little while, this small group, which of course are the people like Houghton and John Holdren and all these others that grabbed environmentalism and used it to push their own political agenda, they took the moral high ground. They controlled everything. It got to the point where it became a religion, and they took over the schools. And anybody that dared to question, said, "Oh, you don't care about the planet, you don't care about the children, you don't care about the future." But gradually, the information starts to come out, and that's what's happened with feminism and with environmentalism. That gradually people are looking at it, and people like me, and saying, "Well, hang on a minute. This doesn't make any sense." Now, initially, of course, you get attacked, and this is what Mahatma Gandhi talked about with when you start with a new paradigm. He said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they attack you, and then you win. Well, we're now in the attack phase. Okay, we're now in the attack phase, and the people that are promoting these paradigm shifts from their own perspective are they have a choice. They can either say, "Yeah, I was wrong, and sorry about that," or what they almost invariably do, because they're making so much money and they built whole careers on it, is they dig deeper and they become more extreme. And so what you see happening right now is they become more and more extreme to the point where even people that don't understand it. They don't necessarily, well, they say, look, what you're saying doesn't make sense. So when it started to cool down by 2004, and the people were saying, well, how do you explain this cold weather? Oh, well, let's do the global warming. What? Are you nuts? That's so illogical that even people that don't understand it start to question. So the extremists, in fact, end up defeating themselves. That's the point we reach. So, for example, with feminism, women saw and men saw, yes, a lot of good things. Still some things need to be changed. But when the women started burning the bra, the other women said, sorry, I need that. You're going too far now. And so that's what's starting to happen now with the whole environmental issue. It's starting to impact. And just to give you an idea, two major polls that have been done over the last 4 or 5 years, one particularly the UN poll, where they've surveyed 10 million people in countries around the world. They asked them 16 questions of concern. What were their 16 concerns in order? Climate change was dead last. Wasn't a concern. The Pew Center, which the Pew
now 32 out of 33 as of today.
With the Pew Center, exactly, and that's not exactly a right-wing group, you know, and so of course what's happening is the public now have parked the issue. They still don't understand it. They still they don't know. But I'm just gonna, they're doing what Mark Twain always advised, that you're better to keep your mouth shut and let people think you're stupid than to open it and prove it. Okay, so what they're doing right now is they're sitting, keeping their mouth shut, and but all of a sudden, one little thing will happen, and suddenly there'll be this complete shift against the whole thing. Now, that's the thing that I'm worrying about now, and I know I think Diamond would be worried, and you, Scott. You see, because as I said, we need environmentalism. It's a good paradigm. But what I'm afraid of is if they've told so many lies about it, that the public will say, we don't believe you anymore, and issues that need to get dealt with won't get dealt with.
Like pollution, like real pollution.
Like real pollution. Okay, now let me give you an example of how much they've lied about this. I was on a radio program out of the States one time, And a guy phoned in and he said, who's killed more people in history? Well, of course, the host and I were saying, oh, Mao Zedong and Stalin and Hitler and so on. And he said, no, you're wrong. He said, first of all, they themselves probably never killed anybody. They had other people do their dirty work for them. And of course, Machiavelli, who's my great hero, said deceivers will always find others who will do this deceiving for them. But he said, no, they're not the biggest killers. The people that have caused, the person that's caused most people to die is Rachel Carson. Well, Rachel Carson, of course, with her book, when it came out, Silent Spring, again at the start of the whole environmental movement. And what was that book about? That book was about the claim.
DDT.
There you go. And that DDT was causing, she said...
birds to die. It thins the shells of birds.
Which was total rubbish. There was never any research that showed that. And so she got DDT banned, and the whole eco thing got banned. Why? Because her husband died of cancer, and she believed that it was because of his contacts with DDT. She had no proof of it whatsoever. But she wrote the book Silent Spring based on that. Okay? And this is the kind of hysteria that catches hold and then people exploit it. And of course, by banning DDT, the figures are conservatively estimated that at least 130 million people have died in Africa and Asia because DDT was not being used to kill the malaria that was causing DDT. Or causing malaria, I should say.
Malaria.
Yeah. So what happened was, by the way, it got so bad that 17 African leaders said, to hell with you. We're going to use DDT because our people are dying. And we'll take the risk on that. Now, this whole idea, when I first appeared before the Congress in Washington, I also was invited to make a presentation at the restaurant called The Monocle. And it's quite a well-known restaurant where you have these kind of offshoot things, presentations. There was a guy at the back of the room that came up after. One of them was Mark Morano, who, of course, was just starting research on behalf of Senator James Inhofe, who was the only senator that fought and exposed and wrote the Senate Minority Report on global warming. But there was another guy by the name of Paul Dreesen, and Paul gave me a signed copy of a book he just published called Eco-Imperialism. And Eco-Imperialism put forward the idea that these Western wealthy armchair environmentalists were pushing eco and environmental values on developing and third world countries that were killing them, that were denying them the development potential that the West had already used, but now were being blocked because of these environmentalists. So eco-imperialism and Paul Dreesen became a very, very important book. But of course, like everybody else, he got attacked and ridiculed and so on. But and by the way, I've expanded that whole idea because it also, within the United States, imperialism and eco-bullying, as I called it, was put upon the American people. You couldn't have development, you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that. And that was pushed and pushed through the EPA by Obama using the bureaucrats. And I just published an article the day before yesterday in which I asked the question, why is Scott Pruett under such attack right now? There have been 13 inquiries in Congress against Scott Pruett, all of it from information leaked by deep state bureaucrats in the EPA. Why is that going on? Well, in the EPA was chosen by Obama to be the agency that would impose the controls on the CO2. Now they took the IPCC, the UN science,
global warming mafia.
Exactly. Now, okay. Now here's what happened before Trump got elected. and he got elected, as you know, in December 2016, November 2016. I got called by Myron Ebell, because Myron he was now head of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'd given a presentation to them back in the late 90s, and Myron Ebell called me and said, "Would you come and talk to us about the EPA, because I've been appointed to deregulate the EPA." Now, this is before Scott Pruett got appointed as the head of the EPA. Myron had spent his career looking at the regulations and how it was being used to control development and industry. And so I went to Washington and appeared with Myron Ebell and a group called Cooler Heads. And I said to Myron, "Well, who appointed you to look after this?" He said, "The Trump group." And I said, "But you were appointed by Trump by this group in October, and Trump wasn't elected till November." And he said, "Yeah, I asked the same question." And the answer I got was, Trump's a developer. Trump knows that if you're not ready to go on day one, you're not going to get the building done. You better have the financing, the money, the equipment, and everything ready to go on day one. And so he said, "I'll tell you how funny this was. We'd done a lot of work, but we didn't do much more because we didn't think Trump was going to get elected. And of course, then when he got elected, we were ready to go." Now, what were they asked to do? They were asked to identify what rules need to be cut, what needed to be done at EPA, who needed to be got rid of, so that when Scott Pruett came in, he was ready to go. He was ready to hit the ground running. Now, how did Pruett know so much about climate and the EPA? And the answer is, he was the Attorney General of the state of Oklahoma. And when he ran to be the AG in Oklahoma, Senator Inhofe flew him around the state and introduced him to everybody. And in those meetings with Inhofe, he learned all about the climate scam and what was going on. So here was a guy that not only knew law, but he also knew about the climate scam, the climate deception. So, of course, the minute he's appointed head of the EPA, he starts cutting the funding, starts cutting programs. For example, one of the things that's already happened is a 40% reduction in the EPA funding of climate research being done to prove the AGW hypothesis. Well, of course,
because that's not science. You don't prove the hypothesis.
Exactly.
You test it.
But you see, the deep state people at EPA had to get rid of Pruett. So they started leaking these stories about, he spent money illegally and he traveled illegally. And as I said, so far,
Tim, we only have 10 minutes left.
Yeah.
And you've pointed a lot of fingers, and I agree with your entire narrative here.
Yeah.
Can you sum it up to our listeners, your perspective? So you keep pointing the finger to deep state, and I agree with you, but what is the purpose? What is the purpose of all this? And does it go back, and I'm going to quickly just throw something in here. Back in 2009, the self-styled good group, you know who they are, Bill Gates, Ted Turner, Rockefeller, financed by Soros and Buffett. They talk about population reduction as being 40 times more dangerous or more important than climate change. And is it this the objective? Is it to reduce the population because they're setting it up so that the systems will fail and people will starve?
Yes, and of course the Saul Alinsky philosophy is the way to do that. And Obama and Hillary Clinton were disciples. In fact, Clinton took courses from Saul Alinsky. But those names you mentioned, Rockefeller was a member of the Club of Rome. Ted Turner was a member of the Club of Rome. Ted Turner, after he sold off CNN, gave $1 billion to the United Nations to set up a thing called the Climate Foundation. And guess who's the chair of the Climate Foundation at the UN? A fellow by the name of Senator Timothy Worth. Okay, now who's Senator Timothy Worth? Well, Worth was the guy that organized the appearance before the U.S. Senate of James Hansen in 1988. And that particular hearing in 1988 at which Hansen said he was 99% certain that humans were causing global warming, which is a total falsehood. That started the whole global warming thing. And worse, and here's what they did. This is how corrupt these people are. And you can read about this if you Google Frontline PBS interview Wirth, W-I-R-T-H. They've got it all laid out there. And what Wirth did was he said, look, we needed somebody that would appear before our committee and say that humans were causing global warming. And we found this guy at NASA GIS, and this is the corruption and misuse of NASA started. We found this guy by the name of Hansen, and he appeared before our committee. They went in, they looked at the weather record for Washington, D.C. and said, what's the hottest day of the year? That's the day they scheduled the hearing for. And they went into the Senate the night before, shut off the air conditioning and opened all the windows in the hearing room. So everybody was sitting there sweating. That's how much they stage managed that hearing. Okay? And these people, as I said, Rockefeller, they were all members of the Club of Rome, and they're all there now still pushing the whole idea. If you reduce the population, of course, you can control people better. And this is another problem that Maggie Thatcher had. Thatcher knew that she needed an educated workforce. Obama knew he needed an educated workforce, but they both knew, left and right, that if you educate people, they start asking questions. That's why, of course, you see this, both Thatcher and Obama with his curriculum, and why Trump's being attacked. DeVos, the woman who was put in charge of education at the federal level, was so attacked because these people knew that if you could control the education system, that's where you could get your message out and indoctrinate, because that's what education has become. So all of these things make sense, and all these people tie together in terms of controlling the size of the population, determining who lives and dies, and so on. And so you can see that, how that has been put together. But what I'm looking for now is a quote from, if I can find it here quickly. Just forgive me for a minute.
So
John,
Tim, while you're searching that info, do you do future climate predictions? Have you looked into the solar science, the work of Zarkova, the coming grand solar minimum? And I believe that we've only began to touch the surface on this conversation. Would you join us in a month and continue the conversation?
Oh, I'd be happy to do it. Yeah. By the way, one of the things that I also had the advantage of was that I worked with Russian, or as they were then, Soviet climatologists. I wrote a chapter in a book called Climate Since 1500 AD. The editor of the book did something kind of interesting in that each author of one chapter became the reviewer of another chapter. So I was assigned Boris Senkov, the Russian historical climatologist. So I had contact with them early. I also worked with the Chinese climatologists because China wanted to increase its food production. We're talking now, 30 years ago. They knew they couldn't increase in the south that much because they were already triple cropping most of their land. The only place they could increase their food supply was in the north. So they wanted to look at how Canada was able to produce so much food in very cold climates. So I worked with them. And of course, they, as we mentioned at the beginning of this program, they were already into cyclical studies of climate. And that's where I got involved with it. And
China has the most detailed account of their failed, all the dynasties failing, correlating directly with the sun shutting down.
Just to get back to that point, I gave a paper at a conference in Italy in 1985, and I was so proud of the fact that I could say that it snowed at Churchill, Manitoba, on October 25th, 1742, and I was feeling very proud of that till the Chinese guy got up and said it started to rain at 1:30 in the afternoon in 4:28 BC. Okay, you win. I surrender.
Yeah.
But here's so of course the Russians and the Chinese have very long been into the relationship between sunspots and global temperature, and of course now with the Svensmark thing, we've got the cause effect mechanism, and so I've been following that whole prediction of the ongoing global cooling. Because of the decline in the sunspot numbers. As you know, cycle 24 reached a low that was only previously recorded at around 1800 to 1820. And that was a time called the Dalton Minimum. Now, I knew a great deal about that because the interesting thing in that Dalton Minimum was that about 2/3 of the way through it, in 1815, the volcano Tambora erupted. And I organized a conference in Ottawa in 1995 on the impact of that volcano. Now, we were just starting to realize that sunspots and climate and temperature change were a factor. And we realized that the temperature was already going down when the volcano erupted. So the issue was, how much would Tambora have impacted if the temperature was going up? And of course, that's an issue for today, because you're looking at the Hawaiian volcano won't affect the global temperature, but the other ones in Southeast Asia. But if I can just slip back to my comments about Holdren, because this guy is truly evil. He with Paul Ehrlich, and he's the guy, by the way, that introduced terms like polar vortex and climate catastrophe and all the rest of it. But he said that they've got to make compulsory abortions legal. And here's the kinds of arguments that he presented to say this. Indeed, it has been concluded that compulsory population control laws, even including laws requiring compulsory abortion, could be sustained under the existing Constitution if the population crisis became sufficiently severe to endanger the society. Okay, now, in other words, he's making the argument that you can do it within the Constitution, but you need to understand what he's saying. He says, indeed, it has been concluded. Well, who concluded it? He did. So he sets up the straw man, okay, and then he says that it could be sustained under the existing Constitution if the population crisis became sufficiently severe to endanger the society. Well, who decides that? He does. So he not only sets up the straw man, but he also is the guy that determines when it gets burnt. I mean, this is incredible. And let me just, and we can go back to this just very quickly if you'll bear with me. But if you go and look at the Agenda 21, they set it up on the basis of certain principles, and one of these was the what's called the precautionary principle. Okay, and you've heard that term, and
I'm well aware of it, which is why GMOs are insane.
Well, of course, but let me read to you what Principle 15 in Agenda 21 says. I got read it here. Don't do this to me. Okay, Principle 15 says, in order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach shall be widely applied by states according to their capabilities. Where there are doubt or where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. Now, that's exactly the same form of argument that Holdren used in promoting compulsory abortions. See, in order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach applied by states.
The phraseology is so loose, they could basically say euthanasia is necessary. We have to kill everyone.
Exactly. But they're saying by states according to their capabilities. In other words, the wealthy states will pay for it and we'll give their money to the ones that are suffering by it. It's transfer of wealth, which of course is what the whole thing is about. And then they say where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage. Who decides that? They do. And then they say lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures. Who decides that? They do. So in other words, it's exactly the same thing that Holdren was doing, Principle 15 of Agenda 21, which of course is the whole basis of what's going on a global scale right now.
Tim, I need to thank you. It's been a pleasure. We're going to have you back in just a few weeks. We'll schedule that. Guys, if you're listening, you just heard it tonight, the synopsis. It's here. And you are a commodity. You could be a casualty of war because climate change is your fault. And they're going to redistribute your wealth whether you like it or not. It's insane. And we've only begun to uncover the narrative with Dr. Tim Ball tonight. If you want to buy his books, go over to Amazon, Human Caused Global Warming, the Biggest Deception in History. He also is the author of The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science, which you can also find on Kindle or paperback. I suggest you buy both of them. And we are currently